I'm Ken Owen.
And I'm Michael Hattem.
And this is History Talks. Now, let's get back to the past. Proclaim liberty throughout all the land, and to all the inhabitants thereof. That's the inscription on the Liberty Bell, a modern icon of American freedom that attracts millions of visitors every year.
The icon of the cracked bell has really become a part of our popular culture. Taco Bell even once used it in a 1996 April Fool's Day advertising campaign.
And the Philadelphia Phillies ring a Liberty Bell every time one of their players hits a home run.
This ball is out of here!
Though, come to think of it, in recent years that hasn't been all that often.
The bell is so emblematic of the United States that the opening sequence of The Man in the High Castle depicts fictional Nazi leaders ordering the melting of the bell as a symbol of their destruction of America's democratic ideals.
But the Liberty Bell only became an icon of American freedom in the 19th century. In the rest of this video, we'll explain how a colonial nuisance ended up inspiring campaigns for civil rights, and how boosters for national unity used the bell to promote American ideas after the Civil War.
The 2,000-pound bell was made in 1752 by the Whitechapel Bell Foundry in London, which is actually still in business. It arrived to a lot of fanfare in Philadelphia, only to crack the very first time it was rung. The original bell was actually melted down and recast a couple of times and eventually hung in the State House in 1753. In the 1760s, it was used so often to announce the increasing number of protests against British rule that by 1772, some Philadelphians complained that it rang too much.
But the one day everyone assumes it rang loudest, July 4th, 1776, it actually remained silent. There was no public announcement of independence on that day, and no mass signing of the Declaration, no matter what John Trumbull wants you to think.
When the British occupied Philadelphia in 1777, citizens took the bell down and secretly scurried it off to the Lehigh Valley, where it was kept under armed guard in a church basement. But this wasn't so much because of its symbolic importance as it was to prevent the British from turning the bell into bullets.
It wasn't until the 1830s that the bell took on national importance. It was abolitionists in Boston and New York, not Philadelphia, who adopted the bell as their symbol. And it was a New York anti-slavery society who, in 1835, first gave it the name the Liberty Bell. Pretty soon, it became a notable attraction, and visitors to Philadelphia wanted to see it in person.
The bell's symbolic importance to abolitionists became even firmer in 1846 when it sounded its last note. The bell cracked while being rung for George Washington's birthday, leading the Philadelphia Ledger to describe it as, quote, irreparably cracked and forever dumb. The metaphor for abolitionists was clear. An America that allowed the sin of slavery, that did not proclaim liberty throughout the land, was also irreparably cracked.
Campaigners for women's suffrage also adopted the Liberty Bell as their symbol. In 1915, while the real bell was travelling west, suffragists cast a replica, changing the inscription to read, "Proclaim liberty and equal justice throughout all the land." The replica thus became known as the Justice Bell, and it remained silent until the Constitution was amended to give all American women the right to vote.
Since 1915, the National Park Service has looked after the Liberty Bell, which is now on display in a special building just north of Independence Hall. Today, the bell is never rung, but it is gently tapped twice a year. Once on July 4th by children of the descendants of the signers of the Declaration of Independence.
And also on Martin Luther King Day. The ceremony began in 1986 at the request of Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King's widow. This reflected the symbolic importance of the Liberty Bell for the civil rights movement. King himself laid a wreath in front of the Liberty Bell On National Freedom Day, 1959, continuing a Philadelphia tradition that had been started by Richard Robert Wright Sr., a man born into enslavement. In 1963, activists from the Congress of Racial Equality staged a sit-in in front of the Liberty Bell, demanding that President Kennedy send federal troops to Alabama to enforce voting rights.
The Liberty Bell was a powerful symbol for suffragists and civil rights campaigners because it had come to symbolize the American Revolution. After all, by the late 19th century, there were few physical relics left from the Revolution, and the bell was one of the most prominent.
Other artifacts, like the original Declaration of Independence, were too valuable or too fragile for public display. The Liberty Bell was one of the few surviving material links to the Revolution, and American civic leaders used it to create a folk memory of the Revolution to foster national and civic pride.
After the Civil War, it became perhaps the nation's most popular traveling exhibit, a symbol of American ideals at a time when the United States was still healing at home and casting itself onto the world stage. Philadelphia's Centennial Exposition of 1876 prominently featured the bell, and many states' exhibits at the exposition featured replicas of the bell made out of various substances identified with those states, like North Carolina's tobacco bell.
Most impressive of all was the Centennial Bell, a £13,000 replica, £1,000 for each original state. This bell rang out 38 times on July 4th, once for each state then in the Union. Leftover metal from the Centennial Bell was then used to make replicas, in miniature, which were distributed to schoolchildren across the nation. This helped cement the Liberty Bell's status as the nation's most treasured relic.
In 1893, the bell traveled to Chicago for the World's Fair, where it stood alongside electric lighting and the first Ferris wheel. This made a clear connection for the large crowds between the nation's revolutionary past and its future promise. Further trips followed, including one to the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, but extensive travel was taking its toll on the bell.
The Liberty Bell's last trip came in 1915. That was a turbulent year in America. It saw anti-immigrant protests following the sinking of the Lusitania, racial violence following the premiere of the movie The Birth of a Nation, and all this occurred amidst the backdrop of escalating war in Europe.
San Francisco's mayor, Sonny Jim Rolfe, believed that taking the bell on a cross-country tour would be a fitting symbol of national unity, not to mention a glorious centerpiece for his city's upcoming Panama Pacific International Exposition.
Teddy Roosevelt and President Woodrow Wilson agreed. When 500,000 schoolchildren chimed in by sending a petition to the city of Philadelphia, a national whistle-stop tour was hastily arranged.
The trip to San Francisco took the bell across the Midwest, the Rocky Mountains, and into the Pacific Northwest. Its return home went through Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and the rest of the South. And President Wilson invited Philadelphia's German-born mayor, Rudolf Blankenberg, to deliver a series of loyalty lectures in which he was to remind his fellow immigrants of their duty to their new homeland.
Between leaving Philadelphia on July 5th and its return home on Thanksgiving night, the Liberty Bell stopped in 275 cities and towns, including Boise, Portland, Salt Lake City, Dallas, and New Orleans. Many arranged parades in honor of the bell, even when it stopped for as little as 3 minutes.
At the exposition itself, the Liberty Bell took pride of place. Organizers estimated that 10,000 photographs were taken daily during its 4-month stay in San Francisco. And on November 10, 1915, the city organized a giant parade to give the bell a rousing send-off on its final journey home.
The 1915 tour cemented the Liberty Bell's importance as a symbol of the American Revolution. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, the Treasury used the Liberty Bell as a symbol to promote its sale of Liberty bonds to finance the war effort. Since then, the bell's image has been used to adorn all kinds of goods, including stamps, postcards, magazine covers, and even basketball jerseys.
Even the British now recognize the iconic status of the Liberty Bell. When Queen Elizabeth visited in 1976, she presented America with a special gift, a bicentennial bell cast by the Whitechapel Bell Foundry.
Even though the foundry still maintains that the original cracked bell was not their fault, it seems that even its makers now look back fondly on its symbolism and significance.
The Liberty Bell has served as a symbol of the ideals of the Revolution and the need to make a more perfect union. Though it was little more than a noisy nuisance to many Philadelphians in the 1770s, it's chimed much more resonantly in the centuries that have followed.
The image of the bell has been used to challenge American leaders who failed to live up to the promise of the Revolution. Abolitionists, suffragists, and civil rights campaigners all used the Liberty Bell to fight for social progress and to celebrate those moments when Americans more fully proclaimed liberty throughout all the land.
In the half-century after the Civil War, the bell became a tool to restore the nation's broken bonds and to heal its wounds as the United States moved into the new century. The bell's many tours gave Americans in towns large and small, thousands of miles away from Philadelphia and Boston, a chance not just to think about the legacy of the Revolution, but to see it with their own eyes and to make and feel their own personal and emotional connection to it.
Today, the Liberty Bell remains a much-loved revolutionary symbol. Paradoxically, it appeals both to boosters for American nationalism and campaigners for social justice. The past is a complex place indeed. For History Talks, I'm Ken Owen.
And I'm Michael Hattem. Thanks for watching.